Hi everyone, thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking about static and dynamic influences on word recognition during reading. So the overarching theme of my talk today is this idea that word recognition is influenced both by static influences, which are going to be characteristics of the word itself. These are going to be fixed characteristics that do not vary with the context in which the word occurs. So for example, word length, the number of letters in a word, and word frequency, an estimate of how frequently the word is used in a language. And this can be contrasted with dynamic influences, which are going to be characteristics that are dependent on the context in which the word occurs. So a way that this has been studied in the literature is through predictability effects, which is how predictable the word is given the prior context. And critically, readers most often read words in context. And so I think that it's likely that both these static influences as well as dynamic influences play a role in word recognition. These factors have been shown to have robust effects on eye movements. So the length effect is such that short words are easier to process than long words. Frequent words are easier to process than less frequent words. And more predictable words are easier to process than less predictable words. And by easier to process in the context of eye movement data, I mean that these are fixated for shorter durations and skipped more frequently. One area in the literature has focused on whether these effects are additive or interactive, and this gets at talking about what stage of processing they're influencing and whether they're influencing stages of processing separately or jointly. So prior work has pretty much unanimously found additive effects of length and predictability on fixations, but there are mixed results for frequency and predictability. Most studies reporting additive effects, although some do report an interaction. For example, one study found that there was an interaction, but it was dependent on another factor, launch site. And this just has implications, as I said earlier, for understanding the different stages of processing in word recognition. So length is typically operationalized as the number of letters in the word. Frequency is an estimate by counting up the number of times a word occurs in a corpus. So a common corpus that's used is the sub-T lex corpus. This contains 51 million words from American subtitles. And I also want to point out that frequency is just strongly and naturally negatively correlated with length. So short words tend to be more frequent. And then predictability is a little bit more difficult to operationalize. So traditionally, predictability has been assessed using the closed procedure, but can also be assessed using large language models, which will be another theme of my talk. So the closed procedure is a procedure where participants are given a text and they have to complete it with whatever word comes to mind. So for example, the athlete pulled a blank. Maybe some of you think of the word muscle here, and then I could count up the number of times muscle was provided by a given participant and get that probability of that word. Closed comes with a handful of limitations that I want to highlight. So one is that it's very time-consuming, requiring a lot of participants and manual scoring of data. Second, it's highly constrained, so whatever contexts were collected are sort of the only context that that measure is valid for. And there are also concerns about validity because the explicit generation of a word in the closed procedure is not necessarily the same process that's happening during implicit word recognition in reading. And finally, and most problematic, is this idea that closed probability does not capture differences between non-probable words. So there are a lot of words you can imagine for this context here that no participant would give as their response. And so those words are going to be set to a probability of 0, and there's going to be no variation amongst them. But now with advancements in natural language processing, we have large language models like ChatGPT, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And these models work on this transformer architecture, which is a deep learning neural network. It takes an input, some amount of text, it processes it through these layers, and then produces an output. So these models are trained on massive amounts of text, and they break text down into tokens through a process called tokenization. These are most commonly words, but can also be subwords or punctuation. And the model learns to predict the next token given the preceding tokens. So this is really like an artificial version of close. I also want to highlight a few reasons that large language models are successful. So one is they utilize contextualized embeddings. This is an advancement from prior models that use static word embeddings. So in the model, each token is represented as a vector in high dimensional space. And by contextualized embeddings, that means that the token's embedding changes based on the context the word occurs in. So an ambiguous word like cast, like the broken arm cast versus the show cast, is going to be represented differently in a model with contextualized embeddings. These models also have a mechanism called mass self-attention, and this just helps relate the current word to the prior words in the context, helping to deal with long-term dependencies and anaphora. And finally, large language models are just massive. So large language models can be scaled in terms of both the amount of training data that they receive as well as the number of parameters in the neural network. Here are just some stats on the GPT family of models. So we started with GPT-2 Small in 2019 with 117 million parameters and 50,000 tokens. And current models have 1.76 trillion parameters and 13 trillion tokens. And fun fact is that GPT-4 can pass the bar exam within the top 10% of human test takers. And finally, this asterisk here just indicates estimates because OpenAI is actually not as open as their name might suggest, and these numbers are no longer fully disclosed. And finally, just in case you didn't know how many zeros that is, these models are massive. So relating this back to human language processing, we want to remember that the large language model is predicting the next word given the preceding words, and we're just referring to tokens as words from this point forward for simplicity. So this allows us to calculate these next word probabilities for any context. There will be a probability that each word in the model's vocabulary will occur as the next word. So we can calculate this probability distribution and individual word probabilities, which are derived from taking the softmax of the large language model's raw logit scores. And this can ultimately, as I've said before, be an artificial alternative to close. So one study by Savoli et al. Actually plotted and looked at differences in closed probability and GPT-2 probability in the Provo corpus. And this first plot highlights that limitation I was getting at earlier. So you see the GPT probability distribution in blue is very normally distributed versus you see the closed probability distribution is represented in that top half, but you see that really tall reddish-orange bar on the left side indicating that all those words were set to a probability of 0. And so again, there's no differentiation between the low probability words. Then we have this middle figure. This is just showing the average accuracy of human closed data at predicting the actual next word that occurred in the text versus GPT-2's top prediction. So GPT-2 was about 32% accurate, and that was about 10% more accurate than the average of human close. And when GPT-2's top 10 predictions were considered, this accuracy went up to 60%. Just a little bit more background, 2 metrics from information theory that will be relevant are entropy. So this is going to be the measure of the randomness of an outcome, and this is based on the probability distribution of all possible outcomes represented using this equation. And surprisal is a measure of how unexpected an outcome is, and this is the negative logarithm of its probability. So applied to words in a text, entropy tells us how constraining the prior context is, whereas surprisal tells us how unexpected the word is. So I just want to highlight an example of entropy because, again, that will be very relevant for the results I'm going to present. So if I have you all read this context, at the orchard, the girl bit into the red delicious blank, and think of the next word that comes to mind. Just hold that in mind and do that again with the second example, the man looked for the small blank. So I bet any money that 90% of the room would have chosen apple here. We might have some variation, but for the most part, people are going to choose apple because this is a very constraining context with clues like orchard, red delicious that are going to lead you to believe very strongly that the next word is apple. Versus if I collected responses for the second context here, I'd expect a lot of variability, right? So there might be some overlap. People might have, multiple people might have said something like dog here, but for the most part, there's going to be lots of variability. So this really highlights a low entropy example on the left. This is a very constraining context compared to a high entropy example on the right, which is a very neutral context. So entropy and surprisal have been studied a bit with regard to their effects on eye movements. Many studies finding that large language model surprisal is a significant predictor of reading times in eye tracking and self-paced reading. Fewer studies have focused on entropy, and among them, there are actually mixed results regarding whether entropy actually has a significant main effect. In those studies that do report effects, it's such that low entropy facilitates processing, so when the context is constraining, we read faster. So putting this all in the context of what I talked about earlier, so we know that length and frequency have effects on reading times and lexical decision times, such that short words are processed faster than long words, and frequent words processed faster than infrequent words. The research question that we were interested in is, does the magnitude of these effects on a word depend on the context in which that word occurs? So more specifically, we were looking for interactions between entropy and length and/or entropy and frequency. The hypothesis was that length and frequency effects will be of greater magnitude, so they'll be bigger when entropy is high than when entropy is low. So in other words, when we have a high contextual constraint, so a really constraining context like the girl bit into the red delicious apple, that's going to result in reduced effects of length and frequency, whereas a low contextual constraint, a neutral context, will result in larger effects. And the rationale behind this is one that the prior context definitely influences word recognition processes. And specifically, when contextual constraint is low, I would think that the processing load of a word is going to be heavily determined by its static characteristics. So this is going to be more similar to isolated word recognition, right, where there's no context at all and those static characteristics are mainly what you have to go off of. Versus when contextual constraint is high, the processing load of a word will be influenced by those dynamic influences like contextual constraint. So I investigated this question in 4 data sets. One was the Provo corpus, which consisted of 84 participants reading 55 short paragraphs, and then the other 3 were from our lab, and so in total we had 438 participants and 600 text stimuli, so a very highly powered study. I removed any track loss or improbably short or long fixations. I removed any proper names or experimental preview manipulations that were present in some of the stimuli collected in our lab. And I removed the first and last word in line to control for any oculomotor noise due to return sweep saccades. Length was operationalized as the number of letters, frequency as the log word frequency from the subtlex corpus. Entropy was calculated using the equation I showed earlier and large language model probability. Surprisal, the negative logarithm of the large language model probability. Word num was the position of the word in the text. Word class was whether the word was a content or function word. And the dependent eye movement variable was gaze duration, which is the sum of all first pass fixations on a word. The large language model used in this study was GPT-2 small from the Transformers library on Hugging Face. We also used the GPT-2 tokenizer and calculated entropy and surprisal in an application programmed in Python where we fed the stimuli into the model. The model calculated those next word probability distributions and then entropy and surprisal using their respective formulas. And there's actually evidence that GPT-2 small fits human reading data better than larger models, and the idea there is that as the models are getting much larger, they are now sort of surpassing and no longer mimicking human experience. For the statistical analysis, I conducted mixed effects regression models. I fit a baseline model with the fixed effects of all the variables I just defined, random intercepts and slopes, although a lot of random slopes ended up being removed due to non-convergence. Then I fit a critical model, which was the baseline model plus an interaction term between entropy and length, which we'll call model 1, and model 2, the baseline model plus an interaction term between entropy and frequency. I compared models using likelihood ratio tests, which is a measure of whether one model fits the data significantly better than another, compared the baseline model to the critical models. I also looked at the Akiki information criterion, which evaluates how well a model fits the data while also accounting for the number of parameters in the model, and in these data, a lower AIC value indicates a better fit. Before I get to the critical results, I just want to present some descriptive statistics here. So this is all just to show that across the 4 data sets, the critical variables are all within a similar range of one another in terms of their means and standard deviations. I also plotted their distributions, again, just to show that there's not, a data set that is unlike the others in any alarming way. So here are the length ones, frequency, entropy, and surprisal. Here are the main effects. So there were significant main effects of length, frequency, and surprisal in all data sets. The length and frequency effects were in their expected direction. Surprisal was such that the more surprising a word was, the longer the reading time, so also expected. Entropy had a significant main effect only in the provo corpus. A reason for that might be is that this corpus consisted of participants reading short paragraphs, whereas A, B, and C were all single sentence readings, so entropy sort of has a longer time to build up over this, and this is kind of also consistent with mixed results regarding main effects of entropy that have been reported in the past. Here are the interactions, their t-values and significance. So the interactions between entropy and length were significant across all 4 models, and same for entropy and frequency. And when I compared the models, the likelihood ratio tests all revealed significant effects, such that the model 1 fit the data better than model 0, and same for model 2 compared to model 0. The AIC values are also all lower for the critical model than for the baseline model. So to visualize these interactions, here we have entropy on the x-axis, ranging from low entropy on the left, which is going to be a constraining context, and very neutral context on the right. On the y-axis, we have gaze duration in milliseconds, and what we see here, we have long words in green, medium in blue, and short in red. And we see a fanning out of this effect. So the length effect is getting larger as the context becomes more neutral or less contextually constraining. And that was as hypothesized. Similar for frequency, we have a smaller but very similar effect. So here we have high frequency in green, medium in blue, and low in red. And we also have a fanning out of that effect as entropy gets higher, so as the context gets more neutral. So to summarize, there are static influences on word recognition, and these do depend on contextual constraints. So the entropy and length, as well as entropy and frequency interactions, were significant and improved model fit in all 4 data sets, supporting the hypothesis that as contextual constraint increases, the effects of length and frequency are reduced. And as I said earlier, the idea here is that when contextual constraint is high, readers may actually generate an expectation about the upcoming word. I want to point out that the level at which this expectation is generated is not entirely clear. So whether people are predicting the specific next word, its semantic features, the processing difficulty of it, we do not know. But whether or not their expectations are supported is going to influence processing load. And this is also supported by the idea that there were significant effects of surprisal in the data sets. Versus when contextual constraint is low, this is going to be more like isolated word recognition, and so readers are going to approach the word without much expectation, and those static influences are going to be dominant. Relating to that prior work I talked about with additivity and interaction with frequency and predictability, I want to highlight that there's a key difference between entropy and predictability. So predictability depends on 2 things. One is the contextual constraint, and second is the identity of the word. So this is more comparable to surprisal, versus for entropy, entropy depends only on contextual constraint. So we chose entropy for this study really to isolate contextual constraint without having the influence of reactivity of seeing the actual next word. And so, yeah, entropy has been talked about in prior literature as being more anticipatory rather than surprisal, which is more reactive. And so this interaction might suggest that contextual constraint influences word recognition in parallel to earlier processes, whereas additive effects that have been reported before might suggest that predictability and length and frequency might influence different stages of processing. Again, prior studies also manipulate predictability and frequency in factorial design, whereas the present study did the analyses on every single word, and there are advantages and disadvantages of each. A final consideration is that length and frequency are highly negatively correlated, and they were in the current data sets. I also wanted to point out that the AIC values for entropy and length models were lower than for entropy and frequency models. So this suggests that contextual constraint has a greater impact on length effects, or potentially that number of letters is a better measure than corpus estimates of word frequency in some cases. But overall, length and frequency are very difficult to separate out in the current study because they were so highly correlated. And the conclusion is just that processing load on a given word is determined by an interplay of static and dynamic influences, static being the length and frequency of the word, dynamic being contextual constraint. And there are different mechanisms of word recognition at different points in a text, again, based on that prior context. And so future directions are to examine whether other measures like skipping or launch site are affected by this interaction, or whether surprisal mimics prior findings with predictability. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that great talk. We now have about 9 minutes for questions, and I'll remember our community that our faculty need to go to that microphone, and this microphone is for trainees.
Hi.
Hi there, thank you. So John Brennan, University of Michigan, and I really appreciate both the large scale of the work and also the focus on interactions. I think that's really going to be valuable for us. I had three questions. The first is whether you considered separating your analyses by function and content words. I think a lot of prior work has shown different effects, for instance, of surprisal on those two word classes.
Yeah, so I didn't do it on these data sets. I did like a very informal analysis on that last year on another data set, and I did find that I think surprisal had effects for, or actually I was still looking at entropy, so I think entropy had effects that were stronger for function than content words, which is kind of consistent with function words being generally more predictable. But that was, again, an informal analysis, and I didn't follow up on that in these data.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have another question. Yeah, so you've these 4 data sets, and I think that's a great strength. And so I wonder if you considered, you presented the analysis looking essentially as like, is the effect significant, and is it going in a particular direction? But you actually have parameter estimates. And so I wonder if you have looked at or can quantify whether the parameter estimates are the same across these data sets. Is the effect of entropy or the interaction of entropy, is it the same across these data or different? And I think there might be some nuance there that could be valuable.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll definitely look into that. I don't have the numbers on hand, but yeah.
Okay, and I'll yield my time. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Jane Lee from Johns Hopkins. So I was wondering sort of the last part of your talk where you sort of suggested that in terms of like low entropy scenarios, they're kind of like lexical decision in some way. But I guess fundamentally, like, they're different, and or I guess like one process might subsume the other, like in some way. And so I was wondering if like the types of, I guess like maybe what the parameters you get from like these models, like these statistical models, like I guess versus like maybe just a pure lexical decision task can tell you about like sort of, I guess towards the end of the talk when you're like, we're not sure like which parts like are important for like which stages of processing. I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah. So you're asking like comparing lexical decision data to maybe the low entropy context?
Yeah,
is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess like, so I guess they're different in a way that like ultimately in this
One is
type
isolated.
yeah, that you would have to even, in a lexical decision task, you don't have to integrate any information into the sentence, but ultimately in this case, you have to try to understand the sentence.
Right, so yeah, integration is happening, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And there is like the whole prediction, integration, sort of debate. And I think surprisal gets at, surprisal and entropy get at that because entropy, again, is based only on the prior context. And so there have been arguments that those effects are, happening earlier because they're based on just the prior context versus surprisal, again, is more reactive. And that could be due to prediction or integration, whereas effects of entropy have been sometimes ascribed to prediction. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Wesley Leong, UConn. I'm not actually faculty, I was sitting closer to this one. Yeah. Question about, so did you also look for maybe an interaction with the frequency and length of the potential competitors? So in a high entropy case, if the competitors themselves are also, sort of long and infrequent, are people then maybe more.
By competitors, you mean like other likely predictions?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we didn't look at that at all, but we could with the Prova corpus with the closed data, or we could do that with like the model's top, K predictions or whatever, but we just looked at the top prediction.
Yeah, gotcha. I'm just wondering if like entropy itself is doing
Yeah.
something, or like
Yeah, that might be
people are,
interesting, and having sort of a factor in there that includes information about whether the word was, in the top X predictions versus just, but I guess surprisal kind of does that. Having like surprisal as the main effect in there is kind of controlling for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, I'm
Hi.
Jin Zin from Mississippi State University. We've done quite a bit of entropy stuff in our lab as well, and one consideration that we had regarding entropy is that we were thinking about, and if entropy is kind of the amount of words that you could potentially come up with to complete the sentence, one may also expect that people who are more familiar with language might be able to come up with a larger amount of words to potentially complete these sort of sentences. And then in addition, if you think about like spreading activation theories of memory as well, then someone might also expect that the more items you can come up with to complete an entropy item might also somehow facilitate that processing through just sheer activation of all of these different features. And so I think maybe, I'm not sure, I think given the response to the last question, you haven't considered this yet, but I think it might be an interesting thing to look at maybe like the top 10 different predictors, if at all possible, in these kind of models, so you can see like, the differential effects on each of these, and maybe somehow if you could like factor all these together, then maybe even though you saw this kind of effect where entropy made the lower frequency words harder to process, then maybe in some cases you might see a differential effect.
Yeah, that would be interesting. It would also be interesting, so one of the data sets has some information about individual differences in like vocabulary knowledge, so that might also be interesting in seeing whether, because the idea is if you have better vocabulary knowledge, you have more exposure to language with what you were saying in the beginning of what you said, and so that might also be interesting to see if that moderates the effect at all. But yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, hi, Lucas from Cornell University. I was eating, so I'm sorry if you've discussed this already and I totally just missed this. I think you mentioned that your results suggest that readers are more sensitive to the effects of length and frequency when the context is less constrained. Do you think that it's like necessarily causal, or maybe it's just like correlated with like another factor that you just did not control for?
Well, interactions generally are taken to suggest that the effects are influencing the same stage of processing jointly. So I don't know if it's necessarily causal, but more so that I don't know, it kind of does seem causal because it seems like the effect of entropy is happening first to determine whether those additional factors are going to have an effect, but like at the same stage of word recognition, if that makes sense.
Okay, I see, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's thank our speaker.